Now, as the fighting between Israel and Hamas continues, some Israelis say it's time for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to resign. Citizens have criticized his deafening silence on the surprise Hamas attack that killed about 1,400 people on October 7. They want him to take responsibility for the assaults. Netanyahu, however, has made it clear that he has no intention of stepping down. Joining us now is senior researcher at Mapungubwe Institute Na'eem Jeenah for some analysis. A very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for your time. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been under heavy scrutiny with calls for his resignation. He says it's not going to happen. Is it a responsible decision for him on his account?
Well, it's very irresponsible for the past, 6 months or so. I mean, his people have been calling for him to resign, marching on the streets every week, etc. Now, of course, the situation has gotten much worse. Not only is he guilty of trying to keep himself out of jail and cover up his corruption and using or modifying the state in order to do that, he's now also presiding over a situation that is widely regarded as being a genocide.
When is a situation dire enough to be classified as a genocide?
It's a very difficult one to meet the requirements of a genocide. I mean, recently 2 people have said that this is what is happening in Gaza now is a textbook case of genocide. One was the head of the New York office of the UN Human Rights Commission. And the other was an Israeli author who's an expert on the Holocaust who said the same kind of thing. But the notion of genocide as a crime comes from 1948, the United Nations Genocide Convention. I mean, firstly, it regards genocide as being an intentional act or acts to destroy a national, ethnic, racial or religious group. And if it can be said to be so, if it meets or if the acts committed are any one of 5 different things. One is killing members of the group with the intention to get rid of the group. 2, causing them serious bodily or mental harm. 3, imposing living conditions that are intended to destroy the group. 4, preventing births. And 5, forcibly transferring children out of the group. Now, in many cases, the kind of difficulty around it is to prove intent. How do you prove that that's the intention, or in this case, that's the intention of the Israelis? They've actually made it very easy. I mean, the Minister of Defense, Israeli Minister of Defense said, for example, we are imposing a complete siege on Gaza, no electricity, no food, no water, no fuel, everything is closed. We are fighting human animals, he said. Then we have the Israeli Minister of Heritage who said this was after the northern part of Gaza was virtually flattened. North Gaza is more beautiful than ever because, of course, the people have been murdered. Blowing up everything is amazing. When finished, we will hand over the lands of Gaza to soldiers and settlers who live in Gush Katif, which is a settlement nearby. So these are statements from Israeli ministers that are basically saying, we want to get rid of all these Palestinians in Gaza. And that is the textbook definition of genocide.
So does this now mean, as you go through those examples, that it's time for the UN to declare the situation in Gaza as a genocide?
It certainly is. I mean, which UN body would do it is a good question. It would, one would assume, be the responsibility of the Human Rights Council. If the resignation letter of the New York head of the council is anything to go by, that council is itself manipulated by the United States in particular, but Western powers in general. At the Security Council, it's clear that the United States will veto anything that is critical of what Israel is doing. The United States refuses to support or has vetoed resolutions, proposed resolutions calling for a ceasefire, as simple as that. in the General Assembly, that could possibly happen. So yes, it is time for the UN to make that declaration. If people within its officials are already saying that is the case, and we have the special rapporteurs for Palestine, for the occupied territories, and a range of UN special rapporteurs that are saying similar things.
I mean, the death toll, as you and I speak, continues to rise. I mean, families have been displaced, and the media personnel on the ground who are reporting this and covering the different, developments have also been severely impacted. I mean, some media personnel have also been killed within the devastation. But before we expand on this, I'd like for you to take a look at this bite on a journalist and the emotions that come with this.
نستطيع أن نحتمل لقد أنهكنا إننا هنا ضحايا شهداء مع فرق التوقيت فقط نحن نمضي واحدا تلو الآخر ولا أحد ينظر إلينا ولا إلى حجم الكارثة والجريمة التي نعيشها في غزة. لا حماية دولية على الإطلاق ولا حصانة لأي شيء. لا تحمينا هذه الدروع ولا تحمينا هذه القبعات، إنها مجرد شعارات نرتديها فقط، هي لا تحمي أي صحفي على الإطلاق لا تحمينا هذه الدروع ولا هذه ما نرتديها فقط، هي شعارات فقط. نحن هنا ضحايا على الهواء مباشرة، نفقد الأرواح واحدا تلو الآخر بلا أي ثمن، نمضي شهداء فقط مع فرق التوقيت. نحن ننتظر الدور واحدا تلو الآخر. زميلنا محمد أبو حطب كان هنا منذ نصف ساعة فقط وغادرنا الآن هو وزوجته وابنه وأخيه وكثير من عائلته هم ضحايا هنا في داخل المستشفى.
Na'eem, what we saw there was a journalist live on air, reporting to the anchor in studio, saying that we are victims, we live live on air, we are victims waiting for our turn. Even the gear and helmet don't protect us as journalists. Also just explaining the emotions, we can't take it anymore. There is no protection anymore. We've been killed one after the other. No one cares about the catastrophe. And really just taking off the helmet, taking off the gear to say that what now? You can see live on air media personnel speaking to their own account of what's happening and how it's affecting them personally, really just showing that, it's getting worse and worse. And the people who are telling the story getting very emotional because it's now personal. There is no protection. No one cares about the catastrophe. What is your reaction to that?
The two things. One is you mentioned, a number of families being displaced. Right now in Gaza, more than 50 families have been completely, entirely wiped out. Like every member of that extended family is now dead, and those families don't exist anymore. So it's not just displacement. I mean, this is what is happening. And in terms of the journalists, it's clear now that there's two things. One is that journalists are being specifically targeted to be killed. And secondly, in many cases, their families are being targeted. So we have now about 3 or 4 journalists who are still alive, but their families have been targeted and wiped out. So it's not just a kind of the case of genocide, but it's also the attempt to ensure that the story doesn't get told. The horrors that are being inflicted on 2.3 million people in this largest open-air prison in the world, that the story doesn't get told. Of course, it's impossible in this day and age for that to happen, but the more journalists can be intimidated in order to stop telling the story, the better for those who are the perpetrators. So it's journalists, it's their entire families, etc., to ensure that the story doesn't get out.
So what now? I mean, we heard U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken urging Israel to protect civilians in Gaza. As this death toll continues to climb, what more needs to happen?
His language suggested that this was a disagreement between him and Netanyahu, or between the U.S. and Israel. But that really counts for nothing if the U.S. is going to protect Israel in the UN Security Council and veto any resolution that calls for a ceasefire. Thus far, 3 resolutions. The Russian, the Brazilian, and the Emirati attempts to pass resolutions in the Security Council calling for a ceasefire. So the words from whether it's Blinken or Biden to say that, you know, they want humanitarian aid, as someone said, one journalist said, you know, they give us, they drop bombs on us and then give us aid. How does that make any sense? And that's the kind of role that the Americans are playing. So unless, and as long as they continue playing that role, the Israelis interpret that as being a kind of green light, a license, and carte blanche to do whatever they want and kill as many civilians as they want to do. I think the stats now say that more civilians have been killed in the past 4 weeks in Gaza than in the past year in Ukraine. So it's close to about 9,500 civilians killed in Gaza, about just under half of which are children. Again, you know, reflecting back on that definition of what genocide is. So what next? I mean, the immediate thing is that we must have a ceasefire. But if the U.S. prevents that from happening, it's not going to happen, and Israel will continue with its genocidal actions. And so I don't know how to answer your question. What?
Yeah, very well. Thank you so much for that. Let's perhaps leave it there for now. Very heartbreaking situation indeed. A senior researcher at Mapungubwe Institute Na'eem Jeenah there speaking about the developments in Gaza.